The city is probably the oldest, most enduring invention of our civilization. The words are interchangeable: civilization, civil, civic, city. Cities evolve over time. They respond to crises, and historically, they emerge from crises stronger than ever before. So what are the future trends for cities, and what are the lessons of history?
Hello, I am Kent Larson, Director of City Science at the MIT Media Lab. So 2020 was a terrible year. The pandemic disrupted the lives of billions of people. It led to depression-scale unemployment, and it revealed tremendous societal inequities. We also experienced political dysfunction, social unrest, and the wildfires in California hinted at how global warming will create a series of additional shocks in a post-pandemic world. But there is reason for optimism. This time of stress creates new opportunities, and there is a renewed commitment to finding solutions to many of the planet's most pressing problems. Addressing some of these challenges will require concerted action at the national and international scale, but I would argue that the grand challenges of our era are best addressed locally, in cities, community by community. Cities will account for 90% of the population growth in the future. It is where most of the wealth will be developed. Cities are where the problems are most visible, where innovation can be most easily adopted. If we can creatively bring together new technology, enlightened public policy, and excellent design, I believe that we can simultaneously begin to address the challenges of public health, of global warming, and of equity. The planet is becoming a network of cities, and successful cities in the future will likely be a network of resilient communities. So in this talk, I will outline what I consider to be the key attributes of a resilient community. I will then discuss the metrics to measure the social and environmental performance. I'll present some of the design and system interventions that we have developed. And finally, I'll explore possibilities for new approaches to public policy using new technology that can facilitate the transformation of a community. So what is resilience? Perhaps the most important attribute of a resilient community is trust. It is no accident that those societies with a high level of trust dealt more effectively with the pandemic than did those highly polarized places. But I want to limit our discussion to what a community might be able to put in place that over time could enable healthy, high-functioning, high-performance communities where trust could evolve. And in the end, I believe there are three key goals that we should aim for. First of all, live-work symmetry. Now, this is the degree to which housing is in sync with available jobs. That is, the availability of diverse, equitable, affordable, and quality housing that is matched to the local jobs in a community. This would include housing for the local workforce, for students, for young professionals, for families, and for the elderly. For example, this would provide opportunities for the police who serve a community to actually live in that community, for elementary and high school teachers to live near their students. If fully realized, this would result in net zero commuting. That is, the number of people who commute into and out of a district each day would be equal. This would dramatically lower the energy consumed and time wasted by transportation. And second, local access to assets. Ideally, people would live near all of the services and amenities they need for their day-to-day needs, including schools, shopping, healthcare, recreation, culture. These should all be reachable by walking, biking, or ultralight mobility modes, and would not require access to cars or mass transit. And finally, local production of resources. Ideally, each community would deploy distributed systems to locally generate renewable energy, process waste, purify water, and produce fresh food. With these resilient community goals in mind, let's talk about the metrics that would allow us to measure the social and environmental performance of a community and to estimate the impact of proposed design, technology, or public policy interventions. So, to illustrate how we approach this, let's start with Kendall Square. Kendall Square is considered by many to be the model innovation district. It is adjacent to MIT and home to a large number of biotech and robotic companies and literally hundreds of startups, but it functions very poorly as a living community. This radar plot is a tool that we have found very useful to visualizing at a glance the environmental and social performance of a district. So let me step you through how to read this. Kendall Square has very high employment density and high diversity of jobs. On the other hand, it has extremely low residential density, with only a relatively small number of very expensive apartments. In other words, it has very poor residential diversity. Because relatively few people live in Kendall Square, there's a low density of cafes and restaurants, what we call third places, that are open at night. And although there is fairly good bike lane infrastructure and a subway, because most people commute into the district from residential areas each day, a lot of energy is consumed by mobility systems. Now we can take these and other values and calculate higher level overall environmental performance related to energy consumed by mobility systems, buildings, the supply chain for deliverables, the percent of renewable energy, and such things. Likewise, we can calculate the social performance of the district by looking at health and wellness as a function of walkability and access to health resources, safety and security, innovation potential, and the strength of social ties and human interaction. Now, to illustrate where this can go, we conducted a thought experiment related to commuting to and from MIT each day. The MIT Transportation Survey, which identifies where people live and work in their commuting modes, reveals that on average, commuters to MIT generate 3 tons of CO2 per person. If all of the combustion engine vehicles were replaced by electric vehicles, this is reduced to 2.19 tons per person, a useful improvement. However, if everyone who worked and studied and taught at MIT could actually live near MIT, and by the way, MIT is developing a 14-acre site at the heart of Kendall Square that could have been used for housing, we would see a dramatic reduction of CO2 to just 0.5 tons per person. Now that's a 6-fold increase in mobility energy performance related to community. There would also be a significant improvement in innovation potential as people would have opportunities for 24/7 interaction. The increase in walkability and physical activity would improve public health, and there would be more eyes on the street in the evening and on weekends, which would improve safety and security. So we believe that it's reasonable to aspire to a 10x increase in both social and environmental performance over a 10 to 20 year period if we brought to bear all of the innovation that we think is possible at the scale of a community. So what are these innovations? I'll outline a few of the projects that we are working on, and I'll frame them in terms of what we think of as the power of without. That is, imagining a world without top-down, centralized conventional systems, and with much lighter weight, distributed, responsive, and ultimately autonomous systems. Cities all over the world are accelerating their plans to provide local mobility without cars. Almost overnight, pop-up bike lanes replace car lanes. Some cities have largely implemented their 10-year bike lane infrastructure plan in just the last 6 months. It is very hard for governments to take assets away from people, but when the lockdown removed cars from streets, this rapid transition was possible, and it's now likely that this change is also permanent. For over 10 years, my group has been exploring lightweight mobility models for central cities. One of our first mobility projects was the MIT City Car with 4 key innovations. First, robot wheels, each with drive motor steering and braking. 2, drive-by-wire, similar to a modern airline. 3, folding so that 3 city cars could be parked in the space of 1 conventional car and 4 front egress directly over the curb. We built a full-scale prototype shown here being tested on the streets of Vitoria, Spain. When we completed this project, however, I decided that the future was with autonomous mobility, which meant that folding was no longer useful since cars would not be stored in high-value city centers. Cities actually needed even lighter modes, I believed, that could occupy shared spaces with pedestrians. We tried to bring together the best features of bicycle sharing, such as Blue Bikes, together with the best features of rideshare, such as Uber and Lyft. This persuasive electric vehicle, as we call it, or PEV, is a bike-like autonomous vehicle that we wanted to function something like a social robot, interacting in a natural way with pedestrians and people. In this scenario, one calls for the PEV like you would an Uber, using your mobile phone. It arrives autonomously for pickup, and it is driven under human power to the destination. It can also operate in what we call donkey mode, carrying packages behind a pedestrian. And just last year, we prototyped an even lighter mode, the autonomous bicycle, which transforms from a bicycle to a stable tricycle. Like the PEV, one would call for it like an Uber. It can then be ridden like a conventional 2-wheel bicycle and converting back to an autonomous 3-wheeler for pickup and autonomous rebalancing. So here we see how lighter mobility modes might replace cars, resulting in an increase in mobility energy efficiency and a reduction of the embodied energy of transportation modes. Now let's talk about housing. For many years, cities have struggled to find solutions to the affordable housing crisis. This is former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg standing on a full-scale floor plan of a 300-square-foot micro apartment. Many mayors believe that in order to remain economically and culturally competitive, housing must be affordable to young professionals, the lifeblood of a city. But this apartment was really just a conventional apartment shrunk to miniature size. During the pandemic, the flight of affluent people to the suburbs may eventually make housing more affordable for young people. But at the same time, the home is now a new center, taking on complex new activities that we formerly thought of as non-residential. The home is now a center of work as companies adopted remote work. It's a center of learning when schools are closed, a center of healthcare as doctors have rapidly adopted telemedicine, a center of exercise as gyms are closed. Trends before the pandemic have now been accelerated. With the affordability crisis and complex new demands in the home, it is clear that we need to develop a new housing model. So central to our new model is the concept of housing without rooms. We started working on this project back in 2014 when we created the 200-square-foot city home that had the goal of functioning as if it was a 600-square-foot apartment. Instantly and effortlessly, the apartment could transform from sleeping with a queen-size bed to a fully functional office, to a dining room for 6 people, to a living room for 6 people. A tiny powder room could open up to be a handicap accessible bathroom with a shower and dryer. So rather than having living rooms and bedrooms, we created a single space that had multiple functions, or in this case, a 200-square-foot apartment that can dynamically convert to any of 6 different floor plans. We're now extending that idea to include a carbon-neutral chassis using cross-laminated timber panels. Since the maximum width of the panel is now 10 feet, we have explored buildings with highly efficient 10-foot bays. This allows for a rapid assembly on the site. And assuming a 30-foot depth, we create units from 300-square-foot micro-apartments to large multi-bay penthouses. But it's the tiny units that are the most interesting. This is a study that makes use of a drop-down bed to convert from living to sleeping, and moving walls can create a guest room or walk-in closet on demand, and a transformable micro kitchen has full functionality in only a 6-foot width. When apartments sell for $1,000 per square foot in high-value cities, reducing the size of an apartment from 600 square feet to 300 square feet while increasing the functionality results in significant savings. A few years ago, we launched a startup from my lab called Ori Living to commercialize the architectural robotic systems that are necessary to enable this kind of dynamic transformation of space. This video shows what we call the cloud bed that I designed for Ori last year. Here, a young woman wakes up in the morning, and as she prepares coffee, her sleeping space effortlessly converts to a living space. I'm pleased to say that Alphabet and IKEA have joined forces now to provide the Series B funding for Ori Living. We're now working with real estate developers from Miami to Vancouver to deploy these systems in commercial housing projects. And if all goes according to plan, IKEA will start selling our systems in their retail stores in Asia in 2021. So we see here how the ability to live large in a smaller, compact, high-performance space can significantly increase the density of housing in the city without adding bulk. In addition to helping to make housing affordable for people not typically served by market-rate housing in central cities, it brings an increase in restaurants and bars, shopping, and cultural facilities. It improves the vibrancy and the innovation potential of the district. A truly disruptive new housing model will bring together multiple innovations. A sustainable chassis is a good place to start, as it could allow buildings to be built faster, cheaper, and better. But in the end, I think this is the least important of all the possible innovations that we're considering. The compact transformable apartments that we're developing could go much further. But there may be an even more important innovation, which I think of as equity without ownership, or perhaps more accurately, equity with tokenized fractional mutual ownership. In a very simple example, the cost of an apartment might be $500,000. This could be shared between the resident and investors. The resident, for example, may purchase 51% of the equity, giving them full control of the development, and the investors 49%. Perhaps 49 investors each purchase 1% and trade their shares in the marketplace, creating a liquid asset out of their investment. In areas of appreciating prices, this offers the possibility of literally cutting the cost of housing in half for residents. But there's a much needed extension of this idea, which combines fractional ownership with a mutual organization. In such a system, the resident enters into a kind of rent-to-buy arrangement where they accumulate shares in a mutually owned facility over time in the form of access tokens. Investors can purchase investment tokens in a building for a fixed rate of return, and over time the community buys out the equity for full ownership. Such a system could also be applied to solar energy, to fiber networks, and to mobility and healthcare services. Eventually, we could take this idea even further by creating a network of tokenized buildings where tokens could be transferred from one location to another, creating not just a liquid asset, but a mobile asset from housing. Systematically developing a new model for housing that includes a carbon-neutral chassis, compact transformable spaces, and more equitable ownership and financing would further improve the social and environmental performance of the neighborhood. Another concept that is extremely important if we are to truly achieve responsive, resilient communities is what we think of as data without surveillance. Data is the fuel that powers most everything that we are considering for the future. Unfortunately, the open data that is most commonly used in the context of cities, such as census data or the National Household Travel Survey, is fairly crude. This is really just snapshots with very small samples. The best data is typically locked down by commercial enterprises, which collects data for their own proprietary purposes. Even in the middle of a pandemic, it took far too much time and effort to unlock Bluetooth interaction data from Apple and Google to be used for contact tracing. And still, the privacy concerns and the low level of adoption have made these systems only marginally useful. We desperately need far better ways of tapping into data that is collected for commercial purposes, but that is made available for the public good. We also need to consider such innovations as shared community data exchanges, where people who produce the data retain control of the use of that data. So to collect fine-grained human behavior information in the home, we've developed a series of sensors that we now call termites. That is the third version of MIT environmental sensors. What you are seeing here is an augmented reality interface to visualize data being collected by these sensors. And in partnership with IKEA, we deployed the termites in a living lab apartment in Malmö, Sweden, where volunteer residents live for several weeks at a time. In this case, the bouncing ball shows the sequence of sensor activations as a person prepared a meal in the kitchen. A new project we have is called Blind Eye, which is an AI camera that does activity recognition at the camera. The unit is designed without the ability to transmit images or videos, thereby protecting the privacy of the occupant. We are developing this to test the premise that such sensing, deployed in assisted living facilities that can recognize changes in activities of daily living and in the objects that people interact with, can be an early indicator of emerging physical and cognitive problems. And we're now integrating activity recognition plus CO2 sensing as a proxy for aerosolized coronavirus, which can accumulate in poorly ventilated spaces. We hope that such technologies could be useful to help safely reopen such places as schools and offices. Harmony without zoning, perhaps the project that I'm most excited about at the moment. But before I discuss this, let me put this work in context. Resilience is the ability to bounce back when stressed without breaking, or preferably to become even stronger when stressed, as is the case when exercising a muscle. A resilient natural ecosystem achieves a state of dynamic equilibrium in which continuous change occurs, yet relatively stable conditions prevail, where the balance of organisms remain in equilibrium and external inputs such as solar energy, water, and nutrients are stable. When a natural ecosystem is disrupted, such as from deforestation or invasive species, pollution, or climate change, or in this case a palm oil farm that encroaches on an Amazon rainforest, the diversity and resilience of the system is compromised. Now, if the external stresses are removed, a natural ecosystem will tend to return to equilibrium. There are, for example, predator-prey feedback loops that come into play. Now, this is resilience. Human communities traditionally achieved a similar kind of equilibrium. The basic pattern of a walled city from 2900 BC largely remained unchanged through medieval times. As cities grew, they almost universally became a network of neighborhoods at the scale of a 15 to 20-minute walk. Human communities have been profoundly disrupted over the past 75 years through globalization forces, speculative housing, gentrification, and retail chains that replace locally owned stores. This can lead to huge inequities and displacement, lowering both diversity and resilience. Conventional land use regulations are the opposite of a resilient, self-regulating system, and extremely difficult to update in response to changing economic, social, or technological conditions. In human systems, market forces alone do not often provide comparable feedback loops to return a community to equilibrium. This can be seen in the disconnect between housing prices and income, and is most pronounced in those communities where the supply of housing is kept artificially low due to zoning. So back to harmony without zoning. In Kendall Square, developers consider the highest and best use of the land to be research labs and corporate offices. But communities, through their governments and land use regulations, control literally trillions of dollars in real estate value. An increase in allowable floor area ratio, for example, indirectly transfers wealth to property owners. So we envision a dynamic algorithmic zoning system to replace static rules, where the communities are guided through a process where they agree on the future they want and decide on the amenities they need. Then dynamic incentives, such as increased density, are offered to property owners, developers, and infrastructure companies to encourage the inclusion of diverse housing for the workforce, for young professionals, for families, for seniors, and others who are not well served by market rate housing. Could even be grocery stores or pharmacies, daycare, local food production, solar energy, parks, bike lane infrastructure, and other amenities that are not currently found in Kendall Square. Now, these assets would be mapped to dynamic incentives which are continuously adjusted. We now have the technology to create a self-enforcing system that makes use of public ledgers and smart contracts. We recently developed a first pass at a simulation tool to test these possibilities. We first looked at what would happen with no incentives by continuing with conventional zoning regulations. We then looked at the possibility for static incentives that do not change in response to actual conditions. With this, there was a modest improvement in performance. And finally, we looked at the possibilities for a dynamic system where incentives are increased or decreased in response to data feeds to achieve the set goals by a community. You can here see how a system might improve on the social and environmental performance of the district by increasing the density and diversity of housing and other amenities. Related to this is order without planning. The conventional process of urban planning does increasingly make use of data analytics, but it rarely deploys systems to iteratively explore a wide range of options with real-time simulation of the social, economic, and environmental performance. Urban planning is a process primarily controlled by experts with little ability to creatively engage with laypeople in the community. So we've developed what we call the Cityscope platform that makes use of a tangible interface with optically tagged Lego bricks. And by the way, we like to use Lego bricks because there is an extremely low barrier to experimentation. People will just naturally begin to play. Onto these surfaces, we project a variety of visualizations and simulations. The radar plot that I described earlier is updated in real time as changes are made to land use, to density, to urban systems. And we can map the actual program of a building and the demographic profiles of the occupants to each unit. In this case, one Lego unit contains 12 300 square foot micro apartments per floor. And in this application, the land use and density of elements in the district are updated in real time using a tablet interface. This shows a visualization of walkable access to parks, where red indicates poor access and green areas have high walkability. A block with the building can be swapped for a park, and the simulation is therefore updated in real time. Layers of simulations can be viewed, such as walkable access to healthcare, to shopping, from homes to jobs, from jobs to homes, allowing for a convergence on an optimal solution according to the value of the participants. In our Corktown Urban Performance Project, we collaborated with a team from Ford to develop an interactive web-based cityscope to explore land use and mobility interventions for Corktown, Detroit. This includes models that estimate the resulting innovation potential, the economic performance, the commuting patterns, and CO2 emissions. And currently on display at the Arsenal in Paris is our project to reimagine the district around the Champs-Élysées in Paris, perhaps the greatest boulevard on the planet, where we modeled the current conditions and then visualized how the community might function in 2030 if a series of interventions are deployed. Here you see Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo evaluating the scenarios that we modeled. And we made use of a similar system in Hamburg, Germany, to help people in the community identify sites to build housing for the 70,000 refugees who were expected to seek refuge in the city that year. We created 2 Cityscope tables that were used for 44 workshops with 30 people each. The first operated at the scale of a district, where people could identify a possible site for housing. Then a plastic square recognized by a computer vision system was used to locate the sites of interest. People then went to a second table where they could move optically tagged Lego bricks mapped to refugee housing units. The system then revealed access to shopping, to jobs, to transportation, to schools, and other amenities around each selected site. At the end of the session, the group reviewed how their efforts compared to those in other districts, with the goal of an equitable distribution of refugee to all districts, rich and poor. This article about the project in the Atlantic magazine referred to Germany's radical pro-refugee urban planning experiment, but it was actually more of a radical community consensus building experiment. So back to Kendall Square, this shows how a data-driven, evidence-based urban programming and design process could allow the community to reach a consensus on an increase in density and diversity without the negatives that they might expect. We explored the concept of cities without at our City Science Summit in Hamburg, Germany last year. This 3-day event took place in the new Elbphilharmonic Hall with a keynote by Lord Norman Foster, who focused on world without slums. So we've been exploring how we might improve the lives of 3.5 billion people who are estimated to live in communities without conventional infrastructure by 2050 by deploying distributed systems related to sanitation without sewers, water without pipes, power without grids, food without soil, and air rights without land ownership. We hosted workshops on themes such as learning without schools, health without hospitals, and governance without bureaucrats. And we've developed a taxonomy of informal settlements, as well as a growing catalog of current and emerging technology that could be deployed in slums and informal settlements by 2030. And finally, I want to mention a project that tries to bring all of this together. The reality is that cities are largely built with private money these days. Investors are increasingly concerned with the environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, impact. And a whole industry has developed to provide ESG ratings for companies and projects. An estimated $21 trillion in investments is available for companies that can show that they're meeting ESG goals. But the current approach to ESG metrics primarily focuses on the internal performance of a company. There is precious little that measures the impact of a company's products and services on the communities where they operate. We are proposing a new set of ESG resilient community metrics that, if successful, could possibly help investors select profitable companies and projects that do the most social good. In other words, we hope that this could encourage pro-social investment and pro-social development of resilient cities in the future. Thank you.